Alright, I guess probably get started a couple minutes after. People should be here. Turn that down a little bit. Don't want it to crack. Oh, a little too much. Testing 1, 2, 3. There we go. Alright. Cool. So I'm here to tell you about jQuery. jQuery. Has anyone used jQuery before today? Or anything? Okay. Long time ago, recently? Fall, okay, so pretty recently. So jQuery is obviously still in use then, right? We're still using it, still in use. So why jQuery? Like, why are we learned this morning how to select items from the DOM and then append new items to the DOM and essentially manipulate the DOM without jQuery. We were able to do that. This is jQuery's main purpose. Why would we still use this library if we can do all of this with the built-in API for the browser, right? So jQuery on their website tell us that if we use jQuery, we can write less code and we can do more with that code. So that's actually, I think, a pretty good sales pitch. We write less, we do more. I feel like at least today we're going to be writing less and doing about the same, but that's pretty close to the same thing, right? If I can write less code and accomplish the same task, that's usually a benefit. So jQuery is not, they're not worried about bragging that this is the case. Right? All right, so that's a good benefit. That'd probably be enough for me to start using it. Compatibility. So this is another reason to use jQuery, which is if I use this single jQuery API in different browsers, then my code will behave the same, whether or not those browsers are the same or not. So that's compatibility. jQuery improves our compatibility across the browsers by providing a common API that we can all use. So I'd say another good reason to use jQuery, maybe browser inconsistency. The third reason why would we teach jQuery is because it's popular. This is a popular library. Maybe not as popular as it was at one time, but when a library gets as popular as jQuery is, people don't stop writing jQuery and then throw out all that jQuery code. Any projects that are using jQuery or were using jQuery 5 years ago that still have a business value will still continue to use jQuery, will still exist, will still need developers to work on them, right? So I'd say the popularity of jQuery is a good reason to learn it because you might end up at a company or work on a project that has an older jQuery project. It's good to know this. It's that common. It's all over the web. It was used in I think WordPress and definitely in Rails, big time. So most of the web that was built over the last decade or so, a lot of jQuery in there. It's not until around 2015 that libraries like React really took off and took a lot of that share from jQuery. So some important dates of jQuery. This is how old it is. Like 13 years almost. August 26, 2006, they released the initial version. Changes the way we develop the web. Version 2 comes out 6 years later. That's a big deal, though. That change that they made. The reason I called this out specifically, and the reason why they went to version 2.0, is they decided at this point we no longer need to support these old versions of IE6, so IE6 and IE8. We don't need to support those in jQuery anymore. So we're going to remove all the code that was meant to support that. And from now on, version 2.0 will no longer work with these old browsers. They probably waited, they probably waited long enough. I don't think many people were affected by this. People just wouldn't upgrade if they needed, if they were concerned about this. But that's a really big time when we can drop those old browsers that we're keeping track of. And I'd say today, the one we're worried about is that IE11. So it'd be really, be nice if we could drop support for IE11 at some point in our development. The last one, June 9th, that looks like they incorporated some ES6, turned on strict mode. Don't look like major changes, but they still did a major release there. Yeah, I don't know. And now I think we're at like 3.3.1 or something like that. And so this is, anybody use Google Trends? Anyone seen it? Tried it? You can search for something, and then what you get back is sort of a graph of how other people have searched for that term over time. So here is a Google Trends search for jQuery. And at the very beginning, we'll say that's 0. Takes about 4 years to gain peak popularity, it looks like. Somewhere in the middle there. And then a very slow decline. And I don't think this is necessarily a decline in the sites that use it. That might be true, it might not. But it's a decline in people searching for us and people's interest. And I bet you if we looked at it around here, you see React and Angular and stuff, they're going the other way. That's becoming more popular in terms of search. This is true for the web is going to happen. Eventually, I expect React to be the old library and some new one to come in and take over in terms of popularity. Okay, I was kind of asked to talk about whether or not what is jQuery a library or a framework? What's the difference? Do we even care about this difference at this point? I tell you right now, I think jQuery is a library. jQuery is it's a collection of functions that tend to serve a pretty specific purpose. I'd say our purpose today is DOM manipulation. They don't give you any opinion on how to structure your files, on how to or name your files or structure your code. They don't have opinions about that. They just say, here's a whole bunch of functions and you use them how you want. I would say that is what I consider to be a library. A library is without opinion and usually satisfies only sort of one responsibility. Whereas a framework, and we're going to be learning frameworks, Ruby on Rails, for example, very popular framework. But it comes with database library and a view library and libraries for everything that you want to do combined together becomes Rails, and then Rails says also structure your files in this way, create these types of directories, write your code in this way. So there's a high opinion of how you should build stuff with Rails. I'd consider that to be more of a framework. So library, single responsibility most likely, smaller, just a bunch of functions. A framework comes not just with a whole bunch of libraries with different responsibilities, but also an opinion on how you should actually write your code. This is just my perspective on these things, a little bit about what I read out there. You ask any mentor, they might have a different opinion. And at the end of the day, to me it's not really important what we call these things, just that we kind of learn how to pick good ones and use them. That's more important to me. Let's choose. I'd be more interested in how do we pick a good library? Like how do we decide to choose to use jQuery rather than is it a library or framework? At that point, it doesn't matter to me anymore. So this library that we want to access, there's many ways to do this. I'm going to load up my notes here. So for getting jQuery, many ways to get jQuery. The first one I've listed here is called a CDN. So number one is a CDN. Does anyone know what CDN stands for? Canadian currency, right? Maybe? CAD? I don't know. CDN. First letter stands for content. The second one stands for delivery. And the third one is network, exactly. So content delivery network. It's a collection of servers, and these servers might exist in different parts of the world, but they will have all of the same files on them. So what's nice is that if I make a request from Vancouver to get jQuery from a content delivery network, then it should find the closest server to me and use that to serve jQuery to me. Whereas if I'm in the UK or something like that, it should find another server and pass me the exact same file, but from that closer server instead. So a content delivery network has this benefit of sort of reducing the time a request takes by making the request happen closer to you, and that's just by having a whole bunch of servers around the world with the same files on them, okay? So that means that we can go over to jQuery's website, click the download button here, and we're going to be given options here using jQuery with the content delivery network. jQuery's official, or the one that they consider official, is provided by a company called StackPath. And we'll notice that other companies also provide jQuery on their CDNs. Google has a CDN here, and if I click on this, it is giving me access to all of these things here. So, all right, I just go to that library. This is me downloading jQuery from a CDN, right? So I could take this thing, go into my document, and right at the top here, which I've already done, script source equals, put that whole link in there, close it off. Great. I've now made jQuery accessible to my application. Now every time I load this thing, it's going to go to the CDN, it's going to download this jQuery file. If caching is enabled, it's going to just grab the cached version, so the second time would probably be faster. But it's not coming off my website. So what are some of the benefits of using a CDN So I talked about one, right? It's about maybe being able to transfer files closer to the actual user who's requesting them. So that's a benefit to a CDN. What else? Let's put in the document. I think that's true no matter how we import this code. With NPM, which I'll kind of show, it would be like a path to node modules /jQuery / distribution or something like that, right? So I could still link to that, no problem, yeah. But I have to serve that file from my web server. I can't just link to that. I have to actually still serve that file to make it accessible, right? One of the benefits, if Google is serving my jQuery library, who's paying for the bandwidth? I don't care, it's not me, right? It's Google. So if I'm using a CDN and my site gains is quite popular and everyone's downloading this jQuery file, well, it's Google paying for those bytes, not me. I mean, I'm paying for the other bytes, but I'm not paying for those ones. So I could reduce maybe the cost for my servers if I use more CDN libraries. That could be something. A third benefit to using CDNs, and I think this is actually quite interesting, maybe lost on some people, but when I download a file into my browser or with my browser, it caches that file. Right? So everyone's cleared their cache before, or everyone's called tech support, and the tech support just says clear your cache, and then it works, right? Something like that. So clearing the cache is an important sort of fail-safe for when the cache gets old and stale. But this idea that I download the file once, I shouldn't have to download the exact same file every single time. I should just use the cached version instead. Well, what's cool is if we all create websites and we all use the same CDN to serve the same jQuery file, then if someone comes to each one of our websites, they only download jQuery once, and the next website they go to, it's using the exact same files. It's already cached, just uses that. So if we use things like Google Fonts, and which is a CDN for fonts, then a user downloads that font, it's cached now. Potentially other sites that use that, we're not even having to re-download that. That's actually, I think, a benefit to speed of our sites and speed of the web. So lots of different reasons to use a CDN. I'm going to leave that in here right now, and I'm going to show you. Another way. So just download the file, right? I can take this file, whether or not it comes from a CDN or what. I mean, if I go over to jQuery here, right at the top, they give me an option to download two different versions of this library. They say download the compressed production version of jQuery or the uncompressed development version. If I look at the compressed version, that's what it looks like. This is compressed. There's no spaces in there because that's a waste of a byte. Right? Maybe some functions are renamed. Look at these. Some of these, there's no way they gave these names. Maybe these were called element and type or something like that at one time, but because these are local variables, the compression tool could just rename those and reduce the size of our code. So if we want to go into production, it makes sense to serve a compressed minified version of this code. If we don't want to, if we're in development mode, I would probably use the development version of this library, which includes all the code but not obfuscated, no variables renamed, easy to read and debug if I need to, right? So the way I can download this, I can just copy all this text, and just save it exactly where I'm serving my current JavaScript file. And I put that in here. I've just downloaded it, right? I guess another way I could do it, right-click, save link as, and then put it in that directory. Both would accomplish the same goal. Now I have this file, jQuery 3.4.0, and if I want to, I can include this here, script source is going to be equal to JS jQuery 3.4.0.js, and that's not how you spell jQuery at all. Okay. So jQuery 3.4.0, I downloaded it and then I linked to it in my document. So now my web server serves this file every single time. The first time a user downloads it, it'll get cached. So every other subsequent time, as long as they haven't cleared anything, they'd use the cache version. If we upgrade our version of jQuery to 3.5.0, next time they go to the site, those aren't the same files anymore, so it would download the new version at that time because it has a new name. That's actually a good reason to do this type of thing with your libraries, to actually name them based on the version, is because that makes sure that when you upgrade, it doesn't use the old cached version on your user's machine. Okay. Third way we can do this is with npm. So with npm, we can npm install jQuery. It's going to add a node modules directory into our folder. Oh. And then I now have node modules here. The problem is I don't have access to this directory through the web, through a web server. Right? So I might have to take this and copy it into the JavaScript directory. Or I might have to maybe create a link or something. I don't know. The point I have here is we will use npm to install our front-end libraries starting in week 6. We are going to move in this direction, and we're going to install all our dependencies using npm. We don't need to do that this week, but when we start using React, we will. So give it a couple weeks, and then we'll use this technique. For now, I would say content delivery network, super easy. Just do that. And if you really feel like it, download it. Those would both be good options. All right. So that's how we get the library. Once we get it and we include it in our file, we get one of these. It's a $sign. This is the variable that has been assigned to the jQuery library. If I go into this project here, I say $sign, this is what I get back. No undefined or not found or nothing like that. It is actually there, and window is what contains it. Window has a function called $sign in it that points to that function that takes a selector and a context, which is actually the API for jQuery. Okay. If I scroll down here some more, we'll see that jQuery also exists. Ooh, I guess I should have learned the alphabet. jQuery also exists. So I have $sign and I have jQuery, and they both point to the same function. So I could use either one of those and it would give me the same result. I recommend using the $sign because it's like 4 or 5 fewer characters, right? Okay. So I have access to this thing. Oops. And here's where it exists in the global scope under the window, like I showed you. So I don't think I need to go over, we understand global scope in the browser, or should I go over it a little bit more? It's okay? Okay, no one needs me. Okay, so we're good. So we can just see that jQuery, the library, when it loads, it creates a variable called $sign in the global scope and assigns this function to it. So we can use that now like so. If we want to select all div elements in the document, this is the selector we would use. Now this returns a jQuery object, and in the jQuery object it has a reference to both those divs. And this reminds me again of this morning when we had that HTML collection. It's very similar to that. Okay. So anytime I call a function or jQuery function like this, I'm going to get back a jQuery object. That's what these functions return. And a jQuery object is a collection of DOM elements. This is a collection of DOM elements with some helpful methods. right? So it's not just a collection of DOM elements like an HTML collection is. It also contains a whole bunch of helpful methods right here. And some of these are going to be familiar to you already. So for example, if I want to get or set the text of this element, or of all of these elements that are in the collection, that's actually what's kind of cool about jQuery, is if I do a selection and it finds all the divs, and I do a .text on that, it's going to actually apply the text to all the divs in that collection. So yeah, if you don't want to do it to all the divs, you need to be more specific in your selection and only select the ones you want to apply that to. But this is actually kind of cool because I don't have to think about taking out just the first element and applying the text to it, which is normally what we'd have to do with the other API. So let's go with this. Text dot. It just did it for both those divs. When I ran that function, it took both of the jQuery elements or the HTML elements that are in the collection, and it changed the text of both of those things to hey. And it gave me back another jQuery object. Keep that in mind. That even though I ran, this was the text function that I ran here, it gave me back that same kind of jQuery object that I'm used to here. So all functions in jQuery return a jQuery object. The jQuery object is a collection of the DOM elements with some helpful methods in them. And we can actually go look at those methods by using console.dir. So we can say console.dir text. Whatever. We look at the prototype. We did that, right? So, or actually, no, $prototype is what I meant to do. I didn't mean to do it right on text. I meant to do it on text.prototype. No, what is it? What is it I wanted to do? That's weird. Oh, $. That's why. It's not the text I want it on. I want it on that jQuery object that we have there, or the whole jQuery thing. So these are the functions that belong to jQuery that come from that library. If you jQuery cheat sheet is a good way to find these functions without having to do that debugging, right? So this has things for manipulation. I can set the text. I can set the HTML. I can empty out something, right? That's some manipulation. I can listen to events. So this API reference is pretty useful for using jQuery. I just paste it into the channel. I don't know if I actually have it in the notes or not, so I may as well just put it there. All right. So here are some of those common functions, the jQuery API. CSS, we've got show and hide, which kind of do the opposites of each other. First, that would actually, if I have a jQuery object that has a collection of elements in it, calling .first would give me the first element in that collection. Maybe I need to do it that way. If I call .val, it would actually change the value of an input or a text area. What I want to call out is that some of these functions have two responsibilities. And I know we talk about having single responsibility and that being a good thing. This is not the API that jQuery chose. They chose an API where we go to val. Here we go. Val can be used in one of two ways. Val can be used without an argument passed to it. And if that's the case, this will just get the value from the element. So actually the code's doing something like if argument 0 is falsy, then we're going to retrieve the data and return that. If we pass a value into here, now it says, oh, well, you're trying to set the data instead. So it would set the value on it. So these functions act as both setters and getters. So value acts that way. And so does CSS. If I want to retrieve CSS, I believe I just call the CSS function. If I want to set CSS, I have to put an argument in there and pass it the CSS I want to add. So yeah, keep that in mind. This API could have two different responsibilities depending on how you call it. Yes? Oh, so the question is, can I add? Can I use .css to add a class? I believe it is used to add style properties onto an element. If you want to add a class, you use the add class function. So I'd grab my divs. Grab my divs. Oh, grab my divs, and then I can say text.cs or .add class. Oops. Something like that. Now these elements have that done class added to them, right? Is that kind of what you were talking about? Okay, cool. Yeah. So that's how I would add a class, is with the add class method, which if I search in here, oops, should exist. There it is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question is about if I have multiple classes. What I expect this to do, if I have an element like this, then the first time I call add class, I would expect it to add the class here. And the second time I call add class, I'd expect it to do this for me. Right? Whereas if I were writing this code myself, I might have to do something like maybe select the div, and then with the div, I have to class name equals first, second. I could set the class name like this, but then if I want to remove one of them, I have to manipulate this string, whereas I can just say, and it figures out where it is in that list and it removes that one for me. There's also toggle class. So if I do a toggle class, then the first time I call it, it'll add the class, and the second time I call it, it'll remove the class, and then I call it again, it'll add the class, but I'm not having to keep track of that. jQuery is managing that for me. So that could be useful for if I want to show and hide something based on a button click. I guess show and hide, there is an API for that. So maybe I call show and then hide, but then I have to think, is this thing showing? If it's showing, call hide, and if it's hiding, call show. If I just do a toggle class, I don't care what state it's in right now. It just goes to the other one for me, and so I find that to be a little bit more straightforward. So a whole bunch of stuff that we can do with jQuery. We showed this morning we could do selection and creation of elements. jQuery also allows us to traverse elements. So I brought up that tree this morning, and I said, what would happen if we already knew where the UL was and we could just search based on that? And maybe we could do relative searches as well. So if I have an LI element and I want to get the list, instead of searching from the top again, looking for the list, I could grab that LI element and ask for its parent. So .parent on an LI on an element would give me the element that is its parent. So this is traversal. I'm able to relatively, from where I am right now in the DOM, traverse to siblings, to children, back up to parents, without having to do a full search every time. Okay? Manipulation is things like changing the value, changing the text, changing the CSS. So all that stuff can be done with jQuery as well. And then creation, I'll show you how to do that with jQuery. Okay. So jQuery is cool because one of the things it does is return a jQuery object every time you call a function within jQuery. And if a function returns an object that has functions on it, and then we call one of those functions and it returns an object that has functions on it, we can chain these function calls. I can do things like this here. Because this returns a jQuery object that contains a collection of DOM elements with some handy functions, one of those functions is called append. So I can call it directly on this thing here. And then append also returns that same collection again. So I could get into a process like this. Create the UL, add a class to it, then set the value of it, and then append it or whatever, right? Like you could keep chaining these methods because every method returns a jQuery object that contains all these methods on it. So does that method chaining idea kind of make sense? That's why, yeah, so this is part of jQuery's API. They enable this, they encourage it. And we don't get this with the stuff we did this morning, because when I did a document.query selector, I got back a node list. It's a collection of elements without any really useful functions on it. And even if I call a for each or something on it, it doesn't return another node list. I can't keep chaining those things together, but with jQuery I can. So here we're selecting button and then adding an on-click event to it. I didn't put the event in there. I'm sorry for that. I think it was because it would have broken off to the next, past the boundary, but that would take an event as well. And then when it's clicked, it'll say button clicked. We talked a little bit this morning about DOM content loaded and how we couldn't select elements until we actually had them in the DOM. So the way that we deal with this in jQuery, we don't need to add an event listener to the document listening for DOM content loaded. Instead, what we'll do is create a jQuery object out of the document. That's what's happening here. Take the document, pass it to jQuery. jQuery returns. What does jQuery return? jQuery object, exactly. And on the jQuery object is a function called ready that takes a callback. And all that's doing is it's gonna trigger that event when the DOM content is loaded. So the same kind of deal. And behind the scenes, I bet you jQuery is listening for DOM content loaded and then calling this function when that's happened. It's just that maybe not all browsers use DOM content loaded. Maybe IE uses add event listener on load. Okay, jQuery knows that difference, figures out what browser you're in, and to you it's no different. To you, we always just use this document.ready thing. Okay, and actually, there's even more shorthand. If I pass a function to this jQuery function here, then that acts as an on-ready function. So I could just say funkyton. Okay. This would be a shorthand syntax for this. Because we're not passing it a string, so it's like that's not a selector. We're passing it a function. You must mean that's your on-ready callback. Okay. So now we've gone through some of these details of jQuery. I'm gonna go do that same project we did earlier today using the, I guess, browser DOM to do it with jQuery instead. Are there any questions before I go on? How are we for time? We got time. Awesome. Looks very similar. I did just copy and paste it, change the background color, added a different title to it, slightly. You're going to notice the DOM structure is exactly the same. Still has the same nodes in there. And I'm going to remove all of this. And we're going to go through it step by step. So what was the first thing that I did this morning? Was it, I think I added an event to this button here. So go ahead. What do I want to do? Yeah, so we are preemptively dealing with that problem. So we know that we need to wait until everything's loaded before we do anything. And this syntax is nice. Now I can hide all my code inside this function again, protect all those variables. They're not going to be global. So two benefits from this. What I want to do now is grab that button. Maybe be pretty specific about it. And then just make sure. So it was able to find that button. I can peek at that button here. If I wanted to, I could access that button and change its inner text, for example. Or I guess set its inner text. Use it, sorry, retrieve it. So even though with this jQuery object, what it does is it wraps HTML elements, and I can access any of those HTML element properties from it there. So with this button, I want to say on, click, handle this with a function that takes an event. Okay. Same problem as this morning, right? We're getting a flash, but it's definitely reloading this page. So we still need to prevent the default behavior. This is jQuery doesn't do anything for us in this respect. It still leaves that up to us. And now when I click this, it doesn't change. It adds my message. Same deal as this morning. All right, what was the next step? I can show you the UI again if you want a reminder. Sorry? Karina? Karina? Yeah. We will want to create an element, but that's after we've typed stuff in probably, right? Like I'm not going to create an element until I have something typed in here. I can't even create the element because I don't know what to type in. So I think what we need to do is retrieve what was typed into the input field first. I think before we create a new element, we need to retrieve that input. So I'm going to grab the input here, just as and we can take a look at that. Oh, I want to input dot val. All right, there we go. So as I type in, I get that console logged out. So I'm retrieving the value here. Right? Remember, I said that these functions have multiple purposes. So when I hit the button now, it's passing an argument to value. So it would set it instead. But what we want to do is retrieve it, right? So maybe we'll say, I don't know, content is equal to select the input and grab its value immediately. So that would be some jQuery, right? I've chained these methods together, and I needed to do the selection on this thing, and then I get the value from it. And so my content here, I can pass to my add to do function that I'm going to create. And then in my add to do, we'll just make sure that that it actually made it into this function properly, that it's the correct value. That looks good to me. Okay. I know this is very repetitive. But there's a few slight differences I want to show you with jQuery that do make it, again, a little bit nicer to write. So for add to do, what was the first step again? Create an element. Okay, so and that element is going to be what type? A list item, right? Or a list. I've already got the list. So I think I just need a list item, right? Okay, cool. Okay, good. Yeah, so li. So what I'm going to do is take that item. And here is a very slight difference. If I do it this way, that will select list items from the DOM. When I add these brackets around it, that creates the element for me. So this is what I would use instead of create element, is I would use that same selector, but I'd pass brackets around my element. Okay? So now, here's that list item that got created, I think. Yeah, exactly. It's this list item that got created. And even when it creates a list item, what does it return? A jQuery object. Yeah, exactly. Always, right? Okay. I've got this item now, What did I want to do to it next? Set text, set text. Does that everyone agree with that? Okay. So I could say item dot. Well, if I can't do inner text. Do we know why we can't do inner text? It's not a property of a jQuery object, right? But item is a jQuery object, so I can't say inner text on item. I could grab that item out of the jQuery object and then do inner text on it, but this is not going to be idiomatic to jQuery. There's a more jQuery style way to do this, right? We can say item.text is equal to content. So we can set it using the function instead. Is that good? Now, we can chain these methods, and both of these methods return a jQuery object, so I should just be able to do all this on this one line. I will create the element and add the text to it. And if I wanted to, I could add classes to it at the same time, right? This is where jQuery, this is what jQuery is talking about in sort of this write less and do more. It's that their API is a little bit simpler, and it allows for chaining, so you're not creating as many variables. You're able to be, it doesn't matter what order we call these things in. They're all returning jQuery objects. So I could do add class and then text, or I could add the text and then the class. Add class is, so I can have a CSS, I can have something defined for this object. So I can say here, div class equals first, right? So let's say that that's my div. And then I do I select the div. If I say div.add class second, then I would expect the change to be like that now. Okay? If there was no item on here, it would just add it. So add class is going to take an element and add a new class onto the list of classes that exists already. It could be an empty string. It could be a space-separated list of classes. The nice thing is that we don't have to worry about what it is right now, and we can just say add class as many times as we want, and it'll keep adding those classes. And if we want to, we can always remove classes as well. And this is nice because if I were doing this myself, what you're really interacting with is if I grab this element here, which is now I'm actually grabbing the HTML element out of this, not a jQuery object anymore. Div.className is equal to first, second, third. This is what it would actually look like in the DOM. And so if I want to remove the class with the name second, then I actually have to write some logic that goes through this, figures out what position second is in, removes it, keeping that one space, and gives me this as a result, right? So I think that jQuery is really helping us out here, because we don't have to write all that code to think about which class am I adding, where is it in the order, how can I make sure that all the other classes stay there when I remove that one. I don't think about any of that with jQuery. I just add a class and I remove a class. Okay. So I hope that is a little bit of an example of why jQuery is still valuable, is that we can do these things with a simpler API. Okay. So the item comes back. I've done this in 2 steps. I didn't have to do an append here at all with a text node. I didn't set the inner text. I just called the text function on it. And then I want to take my list, right? That'll find that list. And I want to append the item to it, right? So this is 2 steps. Create the item with the text, and then find that list item and append to it. Oops, where did I? That's it right there. Okay. But we can even make this a little bit simpler. Because you know how we have append child? And so that means we have to take the parent item and append a child to it. Remember, that's how we do it with the browser, with the browser API. We can only go that way, really, right? We can only append things to their parent. I like this more, where I have this element here. What if instead I wanted to append to a UL? I don't even need this variable anymore. So this is, again, a bit nicer, right? It's because of jQuery's simpler API that I can chain these methods together. So if I have the object I want to append, I don't have to go find the other thing and then append it to it. I can just append this thing to this other item, and the append to function even takes in a selector. I don't have to wrap this in a jQuery object first. Like that might, with a bad API, I might have to do it that way, but this is very intuitive, I think. I hope, at least. Okay. So that's kind of like a shorthand to create a list item, add the text, and then also append it to the list. Let's go back to some of the issues. One of them is that I can add empty things. The other one is that when I submit some text, it doesn't clear it out. So we can do similar kind of thing here. We say if the content, then we add to then we add to do with the content, and then we need to content equals empty string. Is that okay? Well, let's try this out. When I add, it's not doing anything anymore because of that if condition here. When I actually type something in, oh, no, that doesn't work. I mean, I can't just assign to content because content doesn't have anything to do with the DOM anymore. It's just some string value. So in this case, what I have to do is actually grab that input here and set it to empty with the value function. Okay. So now when I do this, that's the result I wanted. Now, what I want to highlight here, one selection, two selections for the exact same element. This is sort of one of these things we need to learn about jQuery is when we're doing selections like this, do as few selections as possible, because every time we do a selection like this, we're starting at the top of the tree, we're looking through all the nodes to find that input field, and then we do it again and search from the top to find that input field. jQuery applications are slow if we just search from the top for absolutely every selection. We have to use traversal. We have to use relative traversal to make things faster. And we also have to cache selectors like this, cache these jQuery objects, so we can reuse them again. So what I mean by that is I would probably refactor this code here to actually happen in a few steps. One where I keep track of this input element, or this jQuery object that has a collection of this input element in it. And then I can just use that here, and I can reuse it down here without doing another selection. So I would expect this to be, more performant, more idiomatic, better jQuery code. Does that kind of make sense? Don't do the same selection if you don't have to with your counters in the character counter. Make sure you're only selecting that counter once. You only need to. It doesn't change through the life cycle of that function, right? All right. So last thing I want to do here is set up. This is a new feature now. When I'm done, I want to click this and have it strike through to indicate that it's done. And the way that we do that is just by finding this element and attaching to it a class called done. Okay? When I attach a class done, I get a strike through, and when I remove that class, no strike through. So I could toggle back and forth between those two options, right? One way to do this is that every single time I create a list item, I wonder about this. I haven't tried this yet. Let's see how it works. So here what I'm doing is I'm trying to append or to attach an event handler to the list item. And when that list item is clicked, it would say this dot toggle. And actually I have to make this a jQuery object in order to do the toggle class on it, right? So I'll pass this object to here. It's going to create a jQuery object out of that. And I want to toggle the done class. Does this work? Yeah. Yeah, that works. Okay. So what I don't like about this is that I'm adding this on click event to every list item when the list item is created. And for this example, it might not seem like too much, but to think about that, to add that many event handlers, it doesn't make sense because jQuery gives us an easier way to do this, or a better way to do this. Maybe it's not as easier to understand, but it's better to use it. So what we can do is here, we will grab this list. And actually, I don't even need a variable for that. I can say list.onClick. Right? Yeah, when I click on the list, event.target, that's going to be an HTML element coming from the event, the thing that accepted the click, maybe. So that works. Now, if I switch this, because let's look at what event target is. So I add an element. When I click on it, it's saying the event.target is that list item. So then I can just toggle class on the list item. That's pretty good. What happens if I wonder if I can even do this. Yeah, let's try that. Here we go. So now I'm clicking on the list, right? And when I click on the list, I get event target of the list. So that doesn't quite give me. So I have to be pretty accurate about where I click, because it could actually be slightly different. Okay. So what if I change this over back to this? Add an element. That's not working anymore. It's console logging the UL. So when I've attached, because I've attached this event to the list, the whole list, when I access it through this, it's considering that I'm thinking about that list that I attached the event to. But I want the events to exist or to occur when I click the list items. Does that make sense? So this is a process called event delegation. I can attach an event handler to a list, but have it trigger when you click on the items that are not yet even in that list. When those items get added, it'll behave the way we want, but we're not having to actually add event handlers to every single list item this way. We can add the event handler to the UL, and then with a very slight modification to this API, tell it that we actually only care about it delegating the events to the list item itself. So now when we do this, it works again because we've told jQuery that it's the list items that we really care about, and when it sets the context of this, it's going to do it for us that way. So look, event delegation is useful. I don't think that you're going to use it in your project. I do have a little bit more about it here. So event delegation allows us to attach a single event listener to a parent element that will fire for all descendants matching a selector. This is that selector. This event will fire for all descendants of the UL that is an LI, whether those descendants exist now or are added in the future. And that's the key here, is that I can create this list, add the event handler, we can add as many items to it as we want, and they will all handle events the way that we expect them to. Okay. That's what I had to show you today. I hope that was useful to kind of see the differences. I think that we were able to do the same amount with less, so that's definitely true. This stuff here highlights the beauty of this API. A lot of the others, you'll notice logically there was no real big difference. It's just the syntax that's changed. I still had to think about what are the steps I need to take. It's just that I could accomplish those tasks with fewer lines of code. As always, message me if you need anything. I'm going to send out the notes now. Thank you.